The ground shakes before you even hear it. Then a shadow moves across the Pelennor fields, blotting out the morning sun. It's not a storm. It's not the black smoke from Mordor. It's something worse. A Mûmak, taller than a house, carrying towers full of warriors, charges forward. Gondorian soldiers freeze for a moment, because this is not an army of orcs. These are men. Real men, with names, homes, and families, marching under the banner of the Eye. Who were they? Why did they fight Gondor for centuries? And what did they hope to gain by siding with the Dark Lord? This is the story of the Haradrim, the warriors of the South. Today we'll explore their lands, their culture, and the centuries of blood that led them here, to the fields outside Minas Tirith. And here's something most people forget. Even Aragorn himself once fought far in the south, long before he became King Elisar. If you want to know more about those secret years, you can find a link to our full Aragorn deep dive in the descriptions. So stay with me, because their story is not just about war. It's about loyalty, pride, tragedy, and the question of whether they were truly the enemy or just men caught in someone else's shadow. To understand the Haradrim, we first have to understand the world they came from. The name Harad simply means the South, and it wasn't one single kingdom. It was a vast expanse stretching for hundreds of miles below Gondor and Mordor, a place of extremes where deserts burned in the day and turned cold under a starlit sky. Harad was divided into two great regions, Near Harad, which bordered Gondor across the great river Anduin, and Far Harad, which lay even deeper south, in lands most northerners had never seen. Tolkien describes Far Harad as a land of black men like half-trolls, suggesting not actual trolls, but tall, fearsome warriors that seemed almost otherworldly to the people of the north. Imagine Gondor's white cities and green fields, then flip the image. Harad was a place of golden sands, red canyons, endless grasslands, and coastal cities that traded spices, ivory, and gold. Its people were seafarers, desert riders, and merchants. Their world was exotic to the eyes of Gondor, but it was also dangerous. Raiding tribes, rival chieftains, and the constant threat of war with the north. And yet, Harad wasn't just a land of war. It was a land of thriving cultures, caravans crossing the desert under a blazing sun, marketplaces full of color and sound, and stories told around fires long before Sauron came to power. For Gondor, Harad was both a neighbor and a threat, a land that could be an ally one year and a bitter enemy the next. That tension shaped centuries of Middle-earth's history, and it sets the stage for why Gondor and Harad would clash again and again, right up until the War of the Ring. But before we get to those wars, we need to look at the people themselves, who the Haradrim were, what they believed, and how they lived. So who were the Haradrim? To the people of Gondor, they were simply Southrons, fierce men with scarlet banners, strange armor and weapons curved like a crescent moon. But to themselves, they were tribes, clans, and kingdoms that had existed for centuries before Gondor was even founded. Tolkien doesn't give us a single origin story for the Haradrim, but we know that men awoke in the far eastern lands of Hildorian, and many of them wandered south in the early days of the world. These southern peoples developed apart from the Edain, the ancestors of Númenor, which means their cultures, languages, and traditions were very different from the Western men we usually read about. Their appearance set them apart as well. Tolkien describes them as dark-skinned, with black hair, often wearing bright robes, golden collars, and turbans. On the battlefield, they carried red or scarlet shields, and were known for their use of scimitars, wickedly curved swords that gave them an exotic, dangerous reputation in the north. But Harad was not one unified empire. It was a patchwork of rival realms and nomadic tribes. Some lived in great coastal cities that dealt in trade with distant lands. Others wandered the deserts as riders, moving with the seasons and waging war when they had to. This meant that at times Gondor could ally with one tribe even while fighting another, a constant game of shifting loyalties. Religion played a major role in Harad's history. In the Second Age, Sauron himself traveled to these lands. To the Haradrim, he did not appear as a Dark Lord, but as a teacher and a godlike king, bringing knowledge of smithing and war. Many of the Haradrim came to worship him, and even after he was defeated and taken to Númenor, his influence remained. By the Third Age, Sauron's cult was deeply rooted in Harad, and many of its chieftains swore loyalty to him willingly. Their culture was proud, warlike, but not mindless. They valued strength, loyalty to tribe and family, and the honor of battle. For them, fighting Gondor was not just about serving Mordor. It was about reclaiming power and territory lost centuries before. When we see them on the Pelennor fields, we're seeing the end of a long story. Generations of warriors who grew up hearing about Gondor as the great northern enemy. And that generational memory would shape the wars to come. The story of Gondor and Harad is not a story of one war. It's a cycle, a feud passed down from father to son, tribe to tribe, king to king. When the Númenóreans first came to Middle-earth, they landed on the coasts of Harad. At first, their ships brought gifts, friendship, and knowledge. They taught the Haradrim skills of farming, building, and sailing. But over time, Númenor grew arrogant and hungry for power. By the later Second Age, the Númenóreans were no longer teachers. They were conquerors. They built great fortresses along the coasts, taxed the people of Harad, and demanded tribute. What began as alliance turned to resentment, and resentment turned to rebellion. When Númenor fell and Gondor rose in its place, the Haradrim were already hardened by centuries of conflict. To them, Gondor was simply the heir of the same oppressors. The early kings of Gondor fought many wars to hold the south. One of the most famous was King Hyarmandassil I, who marched deep into Harad and crushed its armies. He forced Harad to swear allegiance to Gondor, and for a time, Harad was under Gondor's rule. But Gondor's strength would not last forever. The Great Plague swept through the land in the 1630s of the Third Age, killing countless people, including much of Gondor's royal line. With Gondor weakened, the Haradrim rose again. They threw off Gondor's control, retook their lands, and struck north in revenge. From then on, the wars were endless. One generation would see Harad raid Ithilien, and the next would see Gondor retaliate with fire and sword. Harad became one of Gondor's greatest enemies, alongside the Easterlings and the Corsairs of Umbar. By the time of the War of the Ring, this rivalry was more than political. It was personal, baked into the memory of both nations. And this is where Aragorn's story connects to Harad in a dramatic way. Long before he became king, Aragorn, then known only as Thorongil, led Gondor's armies in raids against Umbar and campaigns against the Haradrim. He knew their deserts, their warriors, and their ways. So when he faced them again on the Pelennor fields, it was not the first time he had seen a Haradrim charge. This was a conflict he had lived through before, and now as king, he would be the one to finally end it. If you asked a soldier of Gondor what he feared most about fighting the Haradrim, he wouldn't just say the men, he would say the beasts. The Mûmakil, or Oliphants as the hobbits called them, were living engines of war. Imagine an elephant, but far bigger, taller than a house, with tusks like tree trunks and hide as thick as a fortress wall. The Haradrim didn't just ride them. They built howdahs, wooden towers, on their backs, turning each beast into a moving fortress. From up high, archers could rain arrows down on the battlefield, nearly impossible to reach from the ground. Facing a Mûmakil in battle was like facing a walking siege tower that could crush men and horses underfoot. The ground shook with every step. And yet the Haradrim were dangerous even without their beasts. They were expert horsemen, fierce foot soldiers, and masters of the bow. Tolkien describes their scarlet shields, their bright banners, and their curved scimitars, weapons meant for cutting deep in close combat. Their armies were not disorganized hordes. They were drilled, disciplined, and used shock tactics to break enemy lines. Cavalry charges from the desert tribes could scatter even Gondor's best troops. In the books, Legolas famously kills a Mûmakil single-handedly, climbing its side, shooting every man in its tower, and finally bringing the great beast down. Tolkien even jokes that Legolas did not bother to count it as just one kill. The Mûmakil were more than weapons. They were a symbol. When they appeared on the Pelennor fields, it was a message. The South had come to war, and Gondor was about to be crushed underfoot. But as terrifying as they were, the Haradrim were not invincible. And when they fell hard, as Sam Gamgee would soon witness for himself. When the War of the Ring finally came, Harad answered Sauron's call. Columns of warriors marched north, crossing the great river Anduin. They joined the hosts of Mordor, swelling the Dark Lord's armies until they seemed too many to count. The Haradrim were there at every major battle. Osgiliath, the Black Gate, and of course, the Pelennor fields. On that day, their war horns sounded across the plain, followed by the thunder of Mûmakil. Their banners of scarlet and gold flew above the dust clouds, a sight meant to strike fear into Gondor's heart. And it worked. The charge of the Haradrim was one of the most terrifying moments of the battle. Even the riders of Rohan, who had broken the lines of Mordor's orcs, were thrown into chaos when the Mûmakil came. But Tolkien does something interesting here. In the middle of all the noise and blood, he gives us a quiet moment through Samwise Gamgee. After one clash, Sam sees a fallen Haradrim soldier lying in the dirt, and he wonders, I wonder what his name was, where he came from, and if he was really evil at heart. That single line changes everything. It reminds us that this was a man, someone who had a family, a story, and a reason to be here. Someone who might have been brave, or afraid, or simply obeying a king he dared not refuse. The Haradrim were not mindless monsters. They were people caught up in a war much bigger than themselves. And that is part of the tragedy of the War of the Ring, that so many who died never even knew why they fought. When the Dark Lord fell and the ring was destroyed, the war did not simply end with a cheer. There were still enemies in the south, still armies gathering strength, still the memory of Gondor's long dominance and Harad's long resentment. But now, there was a king in Gondor. And not just any king, a man who had fought in the south, who had seen Harad with his own eyes. Aragorn, now King Elisar, did something rare in the history of Middle-earth. He sought peace, not conquest. He marched south not as a destroyer, but as a diplomat and warrior king, negotiating terms, offering friendship, and, where needed, fighting to defend the new order. Tolkien tells us that many of the Haradrim accepted his peace. Old enemies laid down their weapons. New alliances were forged. This was more than a political act. It was the closing of a wound that had bled for centuries. The Haradrim were no longer just the enemy on the horizon. They were neighbors, partners, and perhaps one day friends. And in that decision lies the true victory of the War of the Ring. Not just the defeat of Sauron, but the hope that men who once fought to the death could share the same road in peace. The story of the Haradrim is not just the story of Gondor's enemies. It's the story of an entire people, proud, fierce, and tragic, who fought for generations under the shadow of the Dark Lord. It's easy to see them as nameless foes, to cheer when they fall on the Pelennor fields. But Tolkien reminds us, through Sam's quiet thought, that every one of them had a name. Every one of them had a home, a story, and a reason to fight. And maybe that is the lesson hidden in their tale. That war is never simple. That on the other side of every battlefield, there are men who might have been friends in another life. This is why the story of the Haradrim still matters, because it reminds us that even in Middle-earth, not every enemy is truly evil, and that peace is sometimes the greatest victory of all. If you want to keep exploring the hidden stories of Middle-earth, make sure to subscribe so you'll be here for the next one.